Hello, I'm Pastor Matthew Verhoeg from the Valley Alliance Church, and today we're looking at a parable that Jesus told, and it's found in Luke chapter 12, verses 13 to 21. The setting is a man who comes up to Jesus and asks him to intervene in a dispute between himself and his brother over the family inheritance. Jesus takes this opportunity to remind the disciples to be on guard against greed. The parable itself begins in verse 16. And he told them a parable, saying, "The land of a rich man produced plentifully. And he thought to himself, 'What shall I do? For I have nowhere to store my crops.' And he said, 'I will do this. I will tear down my barns and build larger ones. And there I will store all my grain and my goods. And I will say to my soul, Soul, you have ample goods laid up for many years. Relax, eat, drink, and be merry.' But God said to him, 'Fool, this night your soul is required of you, and the things you have prepared, whose will they be?'" So we have this rich man who's blessed by God with wonderful crops, and he does something that to most of us would seem really reasonable. He makes plans to build bigger barns to store his crops. Permanent grain storage is generally a great investment. And then he does something else that many would think is perfectly reasonable. He looks at his portfolio and decides that now is the time to retire. Eat, drink, play golf, spend time with the grandkids. What's wrong with the picture? The first thing is look at his attitude towards his wealth. He says, "My barns, my grain, my good, my soul." And what does God say to this? "You are not your own. You were bought with a price. Every beast of the forest is mine, the cattle on 1,000 hills." It is God's barn, God's grain, God's goods, God's soul. And one day he's going to ask for it back. Ironically, you know who's going to own this rich man's stuff? Well, the inheritance is going to go to his kids, who might end up fighting over it, just like the guy who came up to Jesus asking for help with his inheritance. And so the one thing he might leave to his children ends up infecting them with the same kind of greed that destroyed his own soul. This rich man did everything that was worldly wise and yet was a fool because he could not see how frail his earthly investments were. Jesus' point is that it seems wise to store up things on earth, to have a nice house and a nice garage, to pile up our pleasant possessions. And yet these things can only last as long as our life, and that might end this very day. So is the one who lays up treasure for himself and is not rich toward God. In contrast, what we should be doing is being rich toward God. And we do this by realizing that everything that we have is on loan from God. And all of these things are for use in building up his kingdom and for his glory. And from an eternal perspective, it's a far better deal to give things away than to store them up, because this life that we live will soon be past, and only what is done for Christ will last.